Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's great to see such a good turnout, but then it's a very timely topic, so I'm sure this is on a lot of people's radar screens. My name is Mike Fritzy. I'm a vice president at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, where you are now. And in case people don't know, most of you probably know, but we're a science and technology think tank, nonprofit, nonpartisan, focusing on strategic science issues for government policymakers. So we do a lot of work for senior muckety-mucks in the government on science strategy and the impact of science on policy. So there's a lot of stuff going on. One of the big things that's in my own particular area of interest is microelectronics and supply chain. And thus the speaker today in microelectronics and supply chain. Very much in the news these days, right, with all the Huawei concerns and supply chain security. There's a lot of language actually in the recently or soon to be passed National Defense Authorization Act on microelectronics supply chain stuff. So please, when you have a few extra minutes in the bathroom, you can read that, right, and stuff. But there's a lot going on. There's actually a lot going on in the government in supply chain and electronics, which I think is the theme. So I have the pleasure this morning to introduce Nikhil Shenoy. We met at the Trusted Electronics Conference at Crane. Yep. Well, I was going to say Crane, but really Indianapolis was put on by Crane. So Nikhil has a lot of entrepreneurial experience in a number of different areas, including security software, right, doing software for security purposes. He is currently the CEO of Colvin Run, which is a startup company doing a bunch of security software stuff, but particularly blockchains are an interest. And he's doing some work for DoD on applying blockchains to supply chain. A very timely topic, which is why I'm very happy that Nikhil agreed to come here and speak about that.
Thanks.
Nikhil.
Thanks, Mike. Good to meet everybody. Nikhil Shenoy, as Mike said. Another important fact that today is actually my 10th wedding anniversary, so my wife is a saint in addition to everything. Great to be here. This is an important topic. I've learned a lot about microelectronics and blockchain since we started working with defense microelectronics activity last year. What I want to talk a little bit about is the actual problem set. Right? And I've seen several people in the room speak on this before, but I want to talk a little bit, kind of summarize where we're at today, talk about blockchain, why it's relevant, and why it's not relevant. A lot of people sometimes, peanut butter's great, salmon's great, peanut butter and salmon, depends. Blockchain doesn't solve every problem, but I think microelectronics is one of the few good use cases out there, and we'll talk about that. And the particular implementation that we use is using open standards. Not just open source, but open standards. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And trust and assured microelectronics. One of the initiatives in the marketplace today, it's particularly being led by defense because that's the most immediate sensitivity, but I believe it's going to become broader as microelectronics become even more ubiquitous. So if everybody here has a cell phone in their pocket, or you can talk to your car now in a lot of cases, you have a backup camera, there's microelectronics literally everywhere. Even my 4-year-old's drum kit has the ability to record and replay the drums that she plays, but I don't know what else is recording. So we'll learn about that. So the semiconductor industry as a whole is enormous, right? It's a global $1 trillion market, close to $1 trillion, billions of dollars, that kind of order of magnitude. And the United States has been the clear leader traditionally. It's a source, it's a number 4 export of the United States after airplanes, oil, and automobiles. And even in those industries, microelectronics plays a key component with the rise of IoT and other technologies. At the national level, right, from a policy perspective, China is investing, close to $200 billion, is my understanding, north of 150. It's at that point where the numbers get very, very large very quickly. And nowhere is this bigger, like Mike said, in Huawei and the push to 5G. Right? So with 5G, we're going to have this kind of proliferation of microelectronic components that are listening to every type of communication, and we want to be very clear about where those microelectronics came from and where those communications are headed. At a personal level, this is like Mike said, this is top of mind in the media as well. So about a year ago now, this is somewhat questioned, there was a Chinese hack where they installed a dial-it that went into a bunch of server motherboards that just listened. They don't even know what really happened or what they did. It was a lot of effort, and it was more of a test than a real incursion. but it did happen, and it is it was something that garnered a lot of attention. This one's actually kind of scary. I saw this demoed at the same meeting where Mike and I met at MIM, the Microelectronics Integrity meeting. It's called the OMG cable. So if you take this innocuous looking cable and plug it in to a computer, the attacker has full control over your system and access to your whole network. So
there's a lot of free ones at airports, by the way.
you could pick them up, yeah. And the other thing is anybody who has a Nest in their house also has a microphone on their wall. So this is something that I think a few people might know about. But what's scary is what else has microphones, right? My kid's drum kit has a microphone. What else? What other cameras and sensors and widgets are all over the place, right? So another example, just to make it a fun thing, I guess, since we're 8 days away from the end of Star Wars, is that breaches in trust upstream can compromise even the most operationally secure systems. And it's kind of a toy example, but you have malicious insertion into a large system, Galen Ursa over here, and then Akbar reverse engineers it because the plans get in the wrong hands, and you have a catastrophe. Okay, I like to show this slide because this was the DoD slide, and so it's a little bit hard to read sometimes. But they talk about malicious insertion and reverse engineering and all the other kind of potential pitfalls that could be in microelectronics. So this diagram has been around for a while. It was presented at the NDIA a couple of years ago. And in fact, it was actually republished just recently. This week, there was a Trust and Assured Microelectronics Forum in Gainesville, Florida, the TAME Forum. I recommend everyone look it up, and if you're interested, download the paper, which is just recently published. But DoD is looking at this through the eyes of a holistic approach. Right? They're looking at end-to-end security, and the initiative is called MINSEC, the Microelectronics Initiative for Security and Economic Competition. So that's the context of kind of where we're at, right? From a state level down to a personal level, and the implications from DoD. All right? And what they're trying to do is they're implementing and demonstrating assurance capability with transition partners. So there's all kinds of initiatives on the street, and many of your organizations, like the Air Force, DARPA, and others, that are looking at how to kind of secure the microelectronics blockchain. All right? So with that, I'll introduce Polaroid Networks. As Mike said, we're a startup. My co-founder and I went full-time in 2018, and we have a team of advisors, engineers, and data scientists, retired Air Force colonel on our board as well. We are working on the blockchain with Digital Bazaar. These are the guys that actually wrote some of the W3C World Wide Web Consortium standards that we'll go into in today's presentation. I'm also working with Dr. Cameron Patterson, who's an IEEE member down at Virginia Tech. So Colvin Run, in his first full year of business, 2019, we've been fortunate to win 4 SBIR awards. We're using them in the traditional sense as angel investments almost in phase 1, looking at phase 2 as seed. The one of interest for here is called Copia, which is Latin for supply. So Copia Chain is the product that we've built. That's a microelectronics blockchain to capture a whole bunch of different types of information and then securely curate and distribute that information in a meaningful way. All right, so all the work you're about to see here was funded by the Defense Microelectronics activity. Let's talk about blockchain just for a quick second. Bitcoin is not blockchain the same way email is not the internet. Okay? Bitcoin is a use case of the blockchain. Currency is one example of how a blockchain could be used. So Bitcoin is the first decentralized digital currency, whereas blockchain is a distributed data structure where transactions are recorded and approved on a peer-to-peer network. Okay, I'm going to just go in very simple terms. If you want some technical stuff, there'll be time for Q&A. Let's talk about how it works. So I want to give somebody some money. Right? In today, if I have $10 in my checking account, but I write a $6 check to this gentleman here and a $6 check to this lady over here, it's not like $2 show up. Right? The first check might clear, the second one might bounce, and there's a whole clearance. That's why it takes 3 days to make sure money doesn't appear out of thin air. So the problem that blockchain solved, right, and this again, blockchain came out in 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto paper when Bitcoin first came out, it was the double spending problem. How do we make sure that that doesn't occur? And the real breakthrough in cryptocurrency, right, the first real big use case of blockchain, is in the way that that transaction occurred. Okay? And the incentive structure was a real big breakthrough. So again, somebody requests a transaction. I want to pay $6 and I have $10 in my account. The transaction is broadcast to a peer-to-peer network, who then approves, all right, Nikhil's got $10, he's going to pay $6. The network of nodes validates the transaction and a multitude of other transactions and puts them together in a block. And then that block is added, right, cryptographically to the other existing blocks in the chain. And then the process repeats itself. Right, the transaction is complete. My $6 are transferred. I have $4 left, and that record is distributed all over the place. So here's another illustration I like from CD Insights that kind of talks about where this came from. All right, so you might have a physical token. So I had 10 coins and I gave 6 to somebody. Fine. Or there's a digital transaction, right, where maybe you do it through a credit card. Okay, so I'm pre-approved to spend 10 coins, and I do that. What a distributed ledger does is it takes that trusted third-party ledger and really introduces inefficiency. Okay, that's the big breakthrough. Is that now I'm incentivizing people to verify that transaction and have them participate in there without any third party telling them to do so. Okay, it's not like I'm paying a credit card company to verify that, right? When a merchant pays 3%. What I'm doing is that by verifying it myself, the system pays me inherently. Okay, and that's what mining is that I'm getting paid to give my resources to enable these transactions. Right? And that's the big breakthrough, is that you've had billions of dollars worth of investment in blockchain infrastructure without a central authority kind of mandating it or really leading the way. Right? Just inherent to the system itself is the incentive structure. Okay. So that's what blockchain is about. It's the distributed data structure. Okay. And cryptocurrency is a public blockchain where anybody can participate. A private blockchain, I believe, is completely separate technology from cryptocurrency, but the same principle of taking information and sharing it in a meaningful way to drive common gains. And so when a blockchain makes sense is when you have multiple parties with different incentives. You might have regulated boundary conditions so people know exactly what's within their scope versus not in their scope, but they interact with those other scopes in a meaningful way. And they have data that's actually shareable. So just because I share data doesn't mean it's useful. Right? Just because I have data doesn't mean it's useful. But when I have that certain kind of nugget that I can use in my operations that then influences other operations in a meaningful way, that's actionable shared data. Okay? So what I want to go through here is my own example of a kind of a government blockchain use case. All right, so bear with me. These are PowerPoint animations. I know it's kind of old school and taboo now. That's the best way I could describe what's going on. So suppose you have a traditional kind of information flow between a state agency, a municipality, like a county office, and then a constituent business. All right, and then you have multiple stakeholders that want to show control and retrieve data for an audit, let's say. Okay, so I run a state level audit, and that causes a lot of work. People have to go through each of their own independent systems, compare that versus other upstream and downstream systems. It gets aggregated, broken apart, put back together many different ways until it leads up the chain into kind of amalgamated form. Right? So they get a result at the end of the audit. And along the way, you have less resolution, data losses, but you have multiple parties with a common goal of kind of getting the information that's needed to be compliant. You have clear boundary conditions, as you can see here, right, where the data exchanges happen. And there's certain data, the audit data that's been mandated, right? So it's very clear of how that would work, right? So let's take the exact same situation, all right, and install a blockchain. So the way I think about this almost is, suppose you have a water balloon, okay? And now I'm going to put some effort into the bottom of the water balloon and squeeze it so the water is more distributed throughout the balloon. Right? So if I have a lot of work in the back end here, I'm going to put some effort to make that work happen earlier on upstream. So now people are sharing that data actively, okay, in a blockchain. So that's what that boundary represents. And you're adding complexity, like I said. So you have you have a ledger that everybody can see specific information about it, right? You might have some data that's off-chain, so the data that's mine is mine, but the data that I'm supposed to share anyway gets shared. And I can add new functionality on it, right? So that's what a smart contract is. Now, a smart contract, for those of you who've heard of it, is not smart, and it's not a contract. It's just a code, okay? So if a blockchain is just a distributed database, a smart contract is a distributed stored procedure, for those that are familiar with legacy databases. It's just code, okay? interesting here, and this is something I'm going to quote. There's a gentleman named Mark Fisk at IBM who told me about this, and this is his idea: is that with a blockchain set up this way, it's the foundational layer that you can add new use cases on top of it. And that's the other breakthrough. So if cryptocurrency had new incentive structures, it's the new productivity and use cases that can be built once a blockchain is enforced and in place. That's the breakthrough on the private blockchain side. Okay. So now what happens is that audit becomes a lot simpler, right? Because it's front-loaded, because the work's already done, the audit can be continuous. You can have new types of audits where things are done continuously. You could have in-process compliance so that things get addressed earlier on in the supply chain rather than having to react to things when they're broken, right? So if you think about one of the most famous blockchain examples is Walmart's Mangoes, where, for those of you that aren't familiar, to give a 30-second story about it, Frank Giannis was the vice president of food safety at Walmart, and he wanted to recall a pack of mangoes. It took his analysts a week to figure out 3 potential farms where it might come from. So they thought they could do better. They started using a blockchain. I think this was also done by IBM, but I don't recall. And they were actually able to, through the pilot program, not tell you which row of trees it came from in 3 seconds. Right? So that's the real power of blockchain. By kind of rearranging some of these workflows and the way information is handled and shared, you could do things a lot better and faster and ultimately cheaper, where instead of having to recall all the mangoes from 3 farms, they're able to recall certain packages, right? and drive a real ROI when those types of issues happen. All right? So this was, so similar to kind of the drawing here. This is the actual, there's a link here, and I'll send these slides around for those who want it. They actually, put this type of architecture up on the internet. So this is called TradeLens. This was, again, from Maersk's blockchain. Right? So this is all in the public domain. But it uses that similar idea of having the blockchain as kind of a foundational layer, right, where it's like the plumbing almost, that has a lot of use cases built on top of it to enable these kind of new productivities. All right? So this is just my quick drawing of the trade-off between a legacy database and a blockchain. You can do a lot without blockchain in a traditional database, but there are certain cases where it makes sense. Just like you could do a construction site using only a shovel, but there's a reason why they had excavators and large machinery, right? When the use case is big enough, the big machines make a lot more sense. So blockchain really is like an excavator, right? So if you're building a sand castle, like a lot of people do on the beach, if you drive an excavator up, they're going to look at you like crazy. And yet that's what a lot of blockchain use cases are like today. Is people are kind of saying, all right, we could do that using blockchain, but you don't really need to. Okay? So it's a very special purpose tool for kind of larger scale applications. And what that means is that even though you get better compliance, disintermediation, robustness, right, by spreading that ledger around, if one node goes down, the entire system doesn't cease to exist, right, because that data is the same and is replicated everywhere. You are giving up simplicity and performance, right, and a sense of confidentiality. And that's the hardest part of a private blockchain, is the confidentiality. Because everybody believes that data is the new oil or new gold. So why would I want to share that with my nearest competitors, right, unless there was a clear ROI? So I think, a challenge of blockchain is nailing that use case down in terms of what is the real benefit to every single stakeholder along the way. Okay? So that's really what I want to say about blockchain. Were there any questions here? I know this is all very hand-wavy, but I'll promise I'll get to more details in a minute. Okay. Happy to come back.
Well, you talked about public and private blockchains. What about community blockchain? Does that fit into one of those classes, or is it something different?
Like a hybrid blockchain?
What do we call it, community?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that to me falls under a private blockchain, right? Because to me, I think the main difference is that a private blockchain has rules for who's allowed to participate, where a public blockchain, right, in that sense means anybody can participate. So what do you mean by community? Is that?
Well, I suppose you're right. If a group of interested companies, let's say, want to participate in something, that can still make it private.
Yeah. And so that's actually an interesting point, because what we found when we ran into this is that we are not using a blockchain in the strictest sense. There's actually components of blockchain that are very useful, right? So you have an electronic data vault, which is your off-chain architecture. you have the ledger, which is the shared data that everybody can see. You also have the blockchain that attests to that, right? So the kind of trust anchor, if you will. And there's a lot of other little pieces like verifiable credentials and other open standards that holistically, when you put them all together, you can end up with a blockchain. But each of those components has value individually. So putting those together in a meaningful way is why we take an open standards approach, right? So just like Legos or HDMI, you know they're going to fit together in a certain way, okay? Like I didn't call here beforehand, say what kind of HDMI is this, what kind of power source can I expect, right? Because standards are there, you have that pluggability, that interoperability, and I think that's going to be essential for blockchain adoption going forward, right? That's a whole other presentation. Anyway, I just want to touch on here that interoperability is an essential component, and like you were saying, you know, there's a whole spectrum of what blockchain can look like. So Bitcoin and Ethereum are fully baked. You can plug the computer in. In fact, if you're sitting on your phone today, you can join it right now and start participating and transacting on it, right? Because it's fully baked. But underneath, there's a bunch of individual components, right, that are independently useful. So when you end up with something very complicated, like the microelectronics supply chain, where there are thousands of IP cores on a single chip with thousands of different provenances and pieces, you know, all around the world, you want to have something that's a little bit more fit for purpose. So I'm going to talk about what fit for purpose means in a minute, but we use something called Varies Delta. So Digital Bazaar, our partners who are part of the W3C standards committees, have created this platform to build fit for purpose blockchains using the independent components. Okay. So let's talk very quickly about the best problems that blockchain addresses. I think the best one is identity. So I didn't have a good War Dogs reference, so I went with super bad. This is not relevant. But you want to have a way to verify a credential. Okay. And the thing is here, you know, I wanted to go buy a bottle of bourbon from the Virginia DC store. I'm telling this guy how much I weigh. I'm telling him my eye color, my at-home address. Why does that big bouncer need to know all that information when I just want to buy a drink and make sure I'm 21, right? So what it does is it actually enables you to say, okay, well, the state of Virginia attests that Nikhil is 21, has been 21 for a very long time. Right? So that's one thing that solves is that, you know, where identity might be overly packaged, you can decompose that in a trusted way. The other thing that I found it very useful for is meaningful aggregation of information. Right? Credit report to me is one of the best ways I can think of that where blockchain can speed up the process. Right? Yeah, I agree. You can make a credit report today. They don't use blockchain, but it took them 20 years to build it. The system I'm about to show you at the end of this presentation, we built it in 2.5 months using blockchain component. And the credit report's really, really interesting because it gives you that risk metric, right? So everybody in this room who's ever taken out a loan or a credit card, all that activity is logged kind of passively, right? Every time you swipe a credit card, you don't fill out 10 forms and then tell them, you know, this is what I'm doing. But that's kind of the way microelectronics is done today, right? Before I accept a component or feel the component, there's a lot of paperwork and kind of design complexity because of the compliance and contracting and all that stuff that goes into creating these, especially sensitive microelectronic systems. So the approach we're taking with Copia is almost like a credit report for microelectronics. We have very specific metrics and standards that we're putting together, right, using these blockchains. We have electronic data vaults, so everybody has their own off-chain data, and the private data stays private. But by creating a verifiable credential for each microelectronics component, we can create a risk profile for that chip. Has it spent a lot of time overseas? Does it have certain IP cores in it that could act as backdoors? Right? What are those standard metrics? And that's where the research is right now. Okay? And we're working with several partners, and we're talking about how do those metrics come together. Because on the credit report, it doesn't tell you your income, for example. That's very private. But it will tell you how much debt's outstanding versus what's taken, you know, versus what you're using. It'll tell you the length of your oldest account. Okay? It'll tell you a lot of information, you know, in that way. So what are those metrics that people can use to make their own risk determinations of whether to field a microelectronic component? Okay, and that's what we're working on. And so again, this is all funded under this contract through Defense Microelectronics SBIR. We actually built the system, and I'm now going to talk about bringing these two things together: microelectronics and blockchain. Okay, Okay, this is the work that we've done, we're continuing to do, and are looking for additional partners for pilot programs as we speak. So there are two major groups of thought in the trust and assured microelectronics space. One is trust, which some people might call protection. So it was, oh gosh, I think Dr. Lisa Pope, was it, that DARPA was talking about? Porter.
OSD.
Yes. So remember she mentioned this in Detroit, that you don't want to talk about trust, you want to talk more about protection. But the idea of trust, or trust in microelectronics, is kind of the older method where, I know you, you know me, handshakes, I trust your process, I know everything about you, and therefore you're allowed to be a trusted supplier of microelectronics. Okay. The newer way, the way that a lot of DoD is headed and kind of thinking about, is in quantifiable assurance, which is more along the lines of a credit report. But again, I believe that you have to have both. Okay? In order for me to have a credit report, I have to go through a trusted process. I have to apply for credit. I have to have the ability to, take these micro loans every time I want to buy a stick of gum, right? Like there's a whole trusted architecture that supports that quantifiable assurance. That's why the credit card system works. So I believe, we have to bring these together in a meaningful way, and that is methodically aggregated. The data comes together in a way that people can actually use. It's actively curated, so it's not just data, but actionable data. Securely distributed, because microelectronics are so proprietary. There's a lot that goes on in those data exchanges, and it's not necessarily, yeah.
So would those data for your quantifiable assurance, do they exist as of today already, or are you trying to deal with?
They exist. Really, the question is, what do you want to do? I mean, there's probably thousands of attributes that you can create of each microelectronics component, right? Whether you want to do like the physical attributes of it, the measurements of it, you want to think about the number of IP cores on there, the throughput of it. And there's all kinds of stuff, right? Yes.
So are you using assurance in the way that the U.S. nuclear weapons establishment uses that term?
I don't know.
In terms of basically evidence that proves that a given electronic component of a nuclear weapon will in fact perform as advertised.
Yes. So that sounds aligned, right? Will perform as advertised. That I'm assured that this system will act the way I want it to. Right? It's not going to take all my targeting and move it by 10 degrees.
But I think this is more of a provenance. I'm not sure this actually is a functional assurance. This is more a provenance of the records.
Well, it could be, and this is where the research is happening, right? So there.
But it's a great question. I mean, what should be part of this?
Right.
What should be part of this?
And that's exactly what, I actually have a slide on that, so I'll show you. But the idea here is, what are those things that we need to know, right? What is the debt to income ratio of a microelectronics component? Like, should it be test results that talk about some kind of metrics that way? Is it simulation results? Because the supply chain is so complex, there's actually no limit to what can be recorded, but it's a question of what can be actionably recorded. What are people willing to say about a component without, totally compromising it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again, that's exactly what the research is. So I won't go into this too much detail, but the idea here is that you can break it down into integrity and confidentiality, right? So integrity, like you said, is the provenance. Confidentiality would be more about the functionality, right? And what brings them together is accessibility and actually having that information available, right? So this is a slide I was just talking about, where you want to have the standards, metrics, and user experience, right? And there's all these subcomponents, and this is where the active research is going on. So this technology piece is the only one that we've addressed so far, Cold and Run. We've built the technology. Great, right? You could take the technology, throw it out, and put Hyperledger Fabric or whatever blockchain you want, or not even use blockchain, and it's useless without all the rest of the stuff around it. Okay?
Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
Going back to your prior slide, has anybody in DoD accepted this framework for trusted and assured microelectronics? Or is this where you're working and trying to?
This is my opinion.
This is your opinion. It's not a DoD, stamped, accepted definition.
Correct.
Is that right?
No, I don't know if there is one. I mean, I know that there are some in trust,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's been around for the better part of 2 decades. And assurance is kind of up and coming. You'll probably see something similar to this discussed at the upcoming breakfast in January. NDIA has the electronics group, and they have, they have updates on this kind of thing every year. But this is just what I put together because it's the way I think about it, having been in it for a year as an outsider, really.
I think, Taffy, and we'll talk a little bit later after the meeting, I think it's partly under development, right? Because having read the NDA language, right, there is mandate to the secretary, right, from Congress that says, I want a plan for a trusted supply chain. Present me a plan. And something like this could be part of a plan for a trusted supply chain.
Well,
But I don't think there is yet a plan, right?
No, I would agree. I can say that at DARPA we have 2 programs where blockchains are considered. So SHIELD is one where we've integrated the dialet that has unique identity, which is a small chip, with IBM Hyperledger, and then a new program called ACE. We're building hardware root of trust right into the chip designs, and that's also being linked to blockchain, potentially blockchain-enabled mechanisms, so you can track all the chips that are manufactured that contain the root of trust.
So what's interesting on both of those, DARPA SHIELD, you got to talk to Northrop Grumman a little bit about some of the stuff they did also with IBM on DARPA SHIELD. And what's interesting there is that, there's actually any n number of entry points to a blockchain, right? It's not like every single thing now has to have a SHIELD dialet on it that you have to read like this and then put it into the blockchain, right? There could be, there's another company called Dust Identity, which is making the rounds of DoD. They do some interesting kind of dust, actually sprinkle like diamond dust on electronic components and create unique hardware keys. So those could both be 2 different endpoints that write to the same blockchain.
Well, looking at it from a blockchain perspective, the actual root of trust is an implementation detail.
Yeah.
So whether it's a small chip or dust, diamond dust,
Yeah.
the question is, if some kind of unique identity is embedded into all the chips manufactured, can we track billions of chips through the supply chain?
Yeah.
And is this an appropriate technology?
Exactly. And what
the
is the
work
right block?
that's going on right now at IBM, I'm from IBM, and other places as well, has to do with what you're just describing, understanding the supply chain, having a distributed ledger that where every activity can be verified by a whole variety of players. And so you've talked about food safety in Walmart and food safety. That's the point of that food safety kind of a blockchain. And Maersk uses blockchain to track all of its shipments all over the world, and they're finding it's very, very valuable to them in terms of managing their distribution and managing the security of the items in a widespread distribution chain. So it sounds to me like what you're describing is really in keeping with what's happening in industry very broadly.
So there's domain specificity to all of this. Like, for instance, when we started working with IBM, it became clear to us that they didn't really know anything about semiconductor manufacturing.
I wouldn't say
Oh,
that.
no,
Come on,
no.
now.
So let's just say the group that we've been talking about,
That's
the
right.
blockchain people.
The
right?
blockchain, that's a different group entirely.
Right.
So a broad
So-
statement like that really is not fair.
So basically, we have to try to help them learn about, so what are the fab floor appliances that have to exist? What is the interaction with the automatic test equipment in the semiconductor foundry? What happens during packaging? What happens during PCB manufacturing and stuff like that? So Walmart is a good domain.
Right.
Microelectronics manufacturing is another domain.
Right.
When we start talking with the distributed ledger people, they did not have that awareness, and so we have to help them bridge that.
Let me actually address that. That's what I'm going to talk about. But so today, it's a fragmented, vulnerable supply chain. I think to your point, where everything is done on a one-off basis, right? So every supplier has their own security measures. Microchip Corporation we're working with, it used to be Microsemi. They have their own secure programming process flow, SPPS. Xilinx has their own methodology. Intel, Samsung, everybody's got their own kind of security pieces. EDA vendors, so Synopsys, Cadence, Mentor Graphics, they're all, do a similar function, but they do it very differently, right? They have their own flavor of EDA, electronic design assistance. So it still works, but the way I would argue is that today we're in a Craigslist world, okay? Where I can buy sports tickets on Craigslist, just like I can do it for free. I can, create IP cores from different repositories, right? But it's still not it's not the best version of itself, I would argue, right? There's still fraud. You might not know exactly what seats you're getting, right? You might pay floor seat prices for an obstructed view without really knowing it because the experience isn't there, and there's a bunch of noise here, right? I don't think sports tickets even shows up on here. But with Copia Chain is the openly governed architecture, and this is where the fit for purpose comes in with standards, metrics, and use cases. And I think a good illustration of that really is fit for purpose, right? The purpose of buying sports tickets, you use something like StubHub. And this really brings it to life to me as an analogy because you can see that there's a standard way of looking at every stadium and able to kind of click around. It's a very common user interface, whether I'm in Los Angeles or Camden Yards, right? It doesn't matter. The point is that I can buy tickets in the same streamlined way. I have metrics, right? So whether it's lowest price, best value, best seats, I can pick my seats the way I want. And there's a level of quantitative assurance in that, when I buy a ticket, I can actually see the seat. I can, see who I'm buying it from, and I get a digital version of it that I can use right at the gate. And that all collectively is a user experience, right? Knowing that there's also a policy behind it of a backstop, right? I don't think there's anything quite like this from microelectronics today. In fact, one of the key parts of MinSave, which somebody mentioned here at AFRL, is that marketplace, right? And whether blockchain's a part of it or not, I think having that fit-for-purpose architecture is going to be important. So this is what we did. This is about 20% of our report, and each of these blocks is a data model, and we actually did analysis of different blockchain, underlying tools. And anyway, so we've done the analysis, and this is where we kind of ended up right now. This is not intended to be a pretty picture. It's intended to be a display of play, right? So there's an actual clickable demo that takes an A380 flight controller and enables us to kind of see different components of it. But again, the next steps are really kind of getting the standards, security, metrics, user experience, et cetera, right, built on top of this blockchain architecture so that you can really deliver that trust and assured microelectronics environment, right? And that's what Coleman Run's working right now. We're talking to IBM and several others. And actually, what we showed here, this is actually an interactive demo. I wasn't brave enough to do it because, I can try later if people are interested. But the idea here is that each of these blocks is an electronic data vault that has its own set of information that won't be shared broadly. Here we have a God view, so somebody who has been granted permission by each individual player to see all the underlying pieces. And we've done a blacklist. So individual IP core, so this represents, we'll zoom in. That's the individual IP core that has been blacklisted. So you can see the red is the entry points, and the orange are contaminated components. Right, so I call this my mangoes for microelectronics, where we can do a very targeted recall of specific pieces. Okay.
So then what happens when something's blacklisted? So does a company get slapped on their fingers? Do they get a $2.7 million fine like Boeing did for counterfeit parts? What happens? Identifying the problem is only half the solution.
I agree. And that's where
so the rest of this also needs to be modeled as to how to deal with the indiscrepancies.
Correct. So, like to your point, that's exactly right. This is just the technology. Policy's got to catch up. The security's got to catch up. The repercussions from participating in such a system, the incentives to do it, the standard, the metrics, and use cases. There's a lot of work to be done, right? But the technology was the part that we could at least start with, and then begin having these conversations.
So, for instance, just to make it concrete, if elements of this were mandated, if you could say, if you want to sell parts to the government, let's say, for example, you need to join this chain.
Right. So
as an example, that could be policy.
And that's trusted part, right? So today, that's true today. If you want to sell components to, for defense microelectronics activity approved systems,
there are requirements.
You have to be a trusted supplier.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's still going to be true in an assured world, but some of the complexity of the design process might be reduced by, starting with technology. This is kind of the angle we're taking. And there's a lot to it. But to the gentleman's point in the back, you're right. The incentive structure is not clear. Right? Like, I don't know that somebody would participate in this unless it was a clear ROI. Like, I can sell 5 times as many components. It's just that now I have liability, but maybe my supply chain is stronger because now I'm thinking about these things and I have a way to kind of proactively say, oh, if this part's been blacklisted, I'm not going to put it in.
It has to be good for business.
If
Yes.
there's not an
Just the
adequate
government.
consequence, then there will be corruption.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, any system is going to have corruption, right? I mean, you're not going to stop bad players from making bad plays, right? What you want to do is you want to reduce that. And again, security, compliance, all of this, none of it's a destination, right? It's always a journey. I mean, I don't know if the internet was good or bad for security. It just changed the game, and there's benefits with some clear things that we're trying to address, though, right? I think that'll always be the case. But again, the technology is just where we're starting, right? We're a 12-person company. We're not going to do the policy piece of it. It's why I'm hoping to engage with people here. I don't really have much left. There's only really one slide. So this is a summary of, a partial summary of some of the DoD initiatives that are going on. The TAME Forum, again, that just closed this week. I encourage everyone to go to tameforum.org and download the PDF there. NSWC Crane, MIN, that's where I met Mike. They do that every year. MINS, so MINSEC is the overarching initiative that I mentioned. There are two vehicles that I know of that have the funding for it. One is AFRL's MINSAVE, which is Microelectronics Innovation for Next Generation System Advancement Validation. All right, that's out on the street now. It's an ARA, and the SMARTS OTA through NSTXL is another piece. We're working with Defense Microelectronics Activity, and JFAC has also been involved. Right? There's also a component of the Army called Cornerstone that's doing some trusted work on FPGAs and things like that. So, there's a lot of individual components going on. If anybody in the room has an org chart, that'd be great. I'd love to see that.
This week's org chart.
Yeah. But that's really all I had. So thank you very much. And I'd love to keep the conversation for 15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so good.
You, rightly so, you skipped over a lot of the details of how blockchain works. But in my understanding, at least, central to that is the function of mining, which you referred to.
Yes.
Which is the idea that the distributed ledgers in the hands of people who are given math problems, and they compete for the solution of the math problem in order to make the
Brute force.
it's brute force. And it's essential that those people remain anonymous and distributed. At some point, if this becomes pervasive, you're going to run out of miners. A, and B, I don't know how you can incentivize them. With cryptocurrency, they get incentivized by getting some of the crypto. They keep some of it.
Right.
How do you pay them?
So this is where the currency is completely different than the private use case, right? Like the community use case.
So there is no mining in the case of
You don't
private
need it.
blockchains, right?
So proof of work is the traditional kind of like I'm going to burn as much processing power as I can, find a number, and that matches the hash, and I'm allowed to mine that transaction. There's a few other mechanisms out there called POET, proof of elapsed time. There's proof of stake. That's got its own set of issues where you're saying that, all right, well, I own a certain piece of the network, therefore I have say in that consensus, right? Or there's the fact that you just have a voting mechanism, right? And Hyperledger Fabric uses this sense of ordering in peers in order to kind of, sequentially vote on how pieces get written to the blockchain.
So I've read reviews of many of those,
Yes.
and the general conclusion, at least that I come up with, is they are all less secure than mining. But they all have vulnerabilities that can be exploited more so than mining. So I mean, you can do minerless distributed blockchain, but you're going to have to put up with security that is not as good as blockchain would ordinarily advertise.
And that's why.
I guess you have to accept some level of trust in your private blockchain.
If we're
Private
back-
implies that.
If we're back to trust,
Yeah.
all of this goes out the window.
I wouldn't say that.
That's true.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, right? I would say it all goes out the window, because I think that there has to be an element of trust in any system, right? I mean, if somebody takes my credit card, I'm also SOL, that doesn't mean the credit cards are useless, right? So,
But the beauty of mining is that the amount of trust that you have to have in the miners, rather than the system or the cryptography, is low. And
Right.
as you depart that, then trust becomes more important. At some point, you're now trusting in the same way that you would in the conventional sense, and blockchain doesn't add much.
I agree. I mean, and maybe blockchain is not the answer, but the idea of having that credit report style infrastructure, whether you use blockchain or, a bunch of honeypot databases.
Yeah, if I can sort of rephrase it, because these are good questions. I mean, these are really good questions. Is just think of it more. Maybe it's not the blockchain per se. It's are there better ways of doing a digital ledger for supply chain? Maybe that's the way to say it. You can borrow elements from blockchain, but it might not be a pure blockchain solution. This is an exploration of how do you make more secure digital ledgers. And blockchain may be part of it, it may not be part of it, there may be elements of blockchain that are part of it.
I mean, one big question for a supplier would be how do I even work with this? If I'm a Global Foundries or a large provider, I have 10,000 IT systems. Right? How am I going to have an authoritative anything of my own, right? Versus providing information to a public, forum of highly proprietary data for my customers. And that's one of the things that we're looking at right now is like an electronic data vault that everybody owns independently, public ledger that you write only specific information to, but what that information is, we've cast a very, very wide net, and so that's what this is intended to do. This to me is a very wide net of potential data sources, and as we go through pilot programs, we're learning what people are and are not willing to provide. Right? Like if I told you that now every time you want to use your credit card, you have to provide your W-2 from the last 3 years, right? People might not use credit cards as much anymore if that were the case, And again, I'm trying to use toy examples because I don't really know, which of these data sets are people are willing to share.
So what would be the strategy if you had a club of companies, let's say semiconductor companies and
We
fabs,
use, yes.
that wanted to create a community mechanism like this, and in the absence of miners, how would you set up this the mechanism for attaching blocks in the trust?
So in the pilot program that we're just proposing right now for the prototype development, everybody's got their own electronic data vault. We figure out what they're willing to write on there, and then we only write the hash of that data to the blockchain. Right? So that way you can verify that certain pieces. Because the part that comes from a photo mask is going to be very different than the data that the packaging guy puts on there.
So would that apply to a pre-competitive fab space like iNet in Louvain, Belgium, where basically a bunch of companies have come together to prototype microelectronics pre-competitively in the same venue and have to essentially trust the fab equipment that's there?
Yeah, I mean you have to trust your own equipment.
No, but this is a pre-competitive shared environment.
Okay. So where people have certain tracks on a wafer or something,
They have access to equipment, fab equipment. That's very expensive.
Yeah, that could be interesting. Yeah, the tape outs are very expensive. I think actually I think it was your presentation. Right? It was like $5 to $20 million to just do a single design run.
This is just to get the tape out.
Yeah, just to get to that point. Yeah. And so that's why a lot of what we're doing is working with people, even before that, at the simulation stage. What data can we collect?
A quick follow-up to what Lee was saying. So the stuff, and I know it's an early stage of deployment, but the commercial implementations are the ones that are sort of at the serious prototype stage. What percentage of those are public versus private? Do you have like a read of, is it more common to do a private blockchain solution, a public blockchain? Because there's a lot of overhead in the public.
It's more common to do the private. I think, like if you I know, Kathy, you just want to talk about IBM's done hundreds of them. We've done 3.
I don't know the real answer to that question.
I mean, I think in general, the Hyperledger fabric is private implementation. That's what people are doing. And it's kind of weird, right? It's like the internet in the 90s, where you have the Cisco internet, you have the MCI internet, right? And they're all slightly different. People had a different idea of how to own the internet.
I think you started correctly with there's almost a one-to-one mapping, which isn't always correct, between Bitcoin implementation of blockchain and the concept of blockchain. Right? It's a spectrum of technologies, really.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, blockchain, blockchain itself, like I said, is about 10 years old now. And in 2009, all those components were also 10 years old. So it's not like anything in blockchain is particularly new. Right? I mean, Bob Kahn did the document object repository patent in 1997. that basically had the same idea. It just didn't catch on as well because there wasn't money to be made. Right? And even Bitcoin only became popular when the price went through the roof for reasons I don't fully understand.
I don't think anybody understands.
Once you found that there were, college bros becoming multimillionaires, and all that kind of stuff. That's when blockchain became the thing.
Yeah.
And now it's just an interesting term to use because people want to learn more about it. And I think that the use, we're in that what do they call it, the Gartner's trough. I spared everybody from that in this presentation, but I think we're heading to that trough, which is a good time to really learn. Let the tide go out.
The trough of disillusionment.
Exactly. And now we're getting to some, and I believe that this is one of the use cases that may be useful, whether we use a blockchain or not. And I also firmly believe that public blockchain, like cryptocurrency, and a lot of people call it like distributed ledger technology, or they give some other name to a private blockchain, because you don't really need a consensus algorithm, right, if you have that community all set up.
When you talk about the community being all set up, can you talk about some of the risks? If I understood correctly, when you're talking about the problem set being fragmented, vulnerable, blockchain platforms, the risk of not having standards, or is there? What are the incentives to have standards, and what are the risks absent those standards?
Yeah, I mean standards are double-edged sword, right? Because now everybody knows what you're doing. So if I want to attack the electric grid, I kind of know how the whole thing works, right? But at the same time, that's that small piece of danger versus the general benefit of having a standard makes sense. And there's a lot of debate about this, by the way. Open source versus open standards, which one's actually safer? Right? And having an open standard means that now it's open. Everybody knows exactly how to, game the system. I think to somebody else's point, right? So there is risk, right? But I think the benefit is, and the incentive is the ability to expand the supply base, right? To field more modern microelectronics components more quickly. For example, right? There was a chart at the MIM, and I'm going to do this by hand, where they say, all right, here's kind of commercial innovation goes like this, and then DoD was kind of leading microelectronics, and now it's less than 1% of the market, and they're down here on like 60 some odd nanometers when the market's going to 12 and 7, right? And so in order to catch these lines back up and get DoD innovation back on the commercial curve is kind of what they're trying to do with quantifiable assurance and standards and things like that. Right? Am I
No, I mean, the great way to say it is, look, what are the companies at bleeding edge, right? There's 3, and 2 of them are overseas.
Yeah.
And the one that isn't is owned.
And the one that isn't just makes processors, pretty much, for the most part. So,
How do you get to the fidelity of subcontractors? And so if you have, how would blockchain solve the issue or the quandary with subcontracts when, say, you're looking to update or get the most updated semiconductor, but that company might have to rely on subcontractor or subcontractor. How do you validate, or what is
So
the ways
blockchain won't necessarily solve the problem from a technology perspective, right? I mean, again, it's a small piece of this puzzle.
it's a ledger.
Right, it's a ledger.
It's a written
right?
record. It's a record. It's a digital record.
How does QuickBooks solve financial fraud? It doesn't. The point is that
You can put a bad number into QuickBooks, right?
get monitored?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So blockchain monitor give you the ability to see that, oh, this guy's using pre-blacklisted components in his in his delivery, so we want to have a conversation. Right? To that gentleman's point is that that'll disincentivize people from putting those bad pieces in the first place, right? So anyway, so I think that's how the technology does it. I think that the standards could address that, right? Saying that, look, here's a blacklist. We're going to publish the known bad components that you shouldn't be using. And there's a way to access that and share that information. I think that'll go part of the way to doing it. And there's a lot of kind of pieces into it that'll improve.
Have you thought about, beyond the scope of this, have you thought about how you apply this same approach, blockchain, to software?
I've thought about it, but it's very broad, right? And software is a lot trickier, I think, than hardware.
And more hazardous.
More hazardous and more fungible. I mean, my version of Microsoft Word when I was an investment banker was different than anybody else's because I built my own macros and stuff into it, right? Like there's all kinds of, there's no telling what could be done with software. Hardware at least is a little bit more like that.
I want to return to your StubHub analogy. That is a verified reselling, and it seems to me it is, as you say, blockchain is a ledger. It's not going to solve some of these other policy technological problems, but it seems to be drawn entirely from provenance, trusted supplier. If you have electronics that you're looking for that are resold, are used, are obsolete, are no longer manufactured, if a company that manufactured them has been bought and that company was bought, where do you see blockchain entering, or would it really only, your starting point would be anything that you can trace from its original production, starting from not even today, but months or years from now when such a thing would be implemented?
So imagine a credit report that tells you, this is their usage to availability ratio. I don't know when their first credit card was opened, but I have partial information. At least you have some information that you can go on, and if those risk factors meet what you need, then you could weigh using that component versus the security gaps, or you can address those security gaps. But once you have the information, there's a lot more you can do with it. Today, I don't believe that that's the case where the information is even there. So that's one thing, right? Without blockchain, having a credit report for microelectronics components will go a long way to at least beginning to understand the risks of using the component. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm just wondering how much of an advantage that is over existing like counterfeit reports for parts, family parts.
I wouldn't say it's any different. It's just that instead of having to go to a file folder, you're able to now have it on the system and be able to log that information somewhere that it can be used, right? So if I'm go through several programs and then 10 years from now somebody opens up a box that's been sitting there and now I want to use this component, I don't know, it's not going to solve that problem, right? If it wasn't part of the system to begin with.
Precisely.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this would be better on a going forward basis to kind of catch up those innovation pathways. But for the past part, that's a problem that can be that could be addressed by the system, right? But it will still take an initiative to kind of get those modern pieces up there, or catalog pieces. In fact, DLA there was like an SBIR round maybe about a year ago, where they just listed a bunch of individual components for people to reverse engineer. Right? So an initiative like that would be a great way where you say, all right, now I'm going to reverse engineer all these individual components, and I'm going to attest, what the designs look like on the blockchain, so I know what performance to expect out of these when somebody does in fact feel them. So there's all kinds of things you could do once, like I said, right? Once that infrastructure is in place, you can build new use cases on it. And that's a very exciting one, actually.
So because of the computational expense of the distributed ledger and your scope, which is all of microelectronics, how scalable is this?
It's very scalable. So the point is that because we're doing it the way we're doing it, where you have individual electronic data vaults, right, and the public blockchain is separate. I didn't put that slide in here. Now I'm kicking myself. But I'll follow up with the links if you email me. It's all online about how the individual components are separate from that public blockchain.
But is it even computationally expensive if you're not doing consensus? Where's the computation?
It's mostly just storage.
Yeah. So there's no computation.
Because what you're doing is you're storing the hash of the information. So I kind of skipped over, like you said.
Are you computing the hash stuff?
You can, yeah. But not the entire network every single time. This is the electronic data vault is saying, all right, here's the data that was in it, here's the hash of information, I'm going to store that. So now I'm going to say, all right, Nikhil Shenoy from the state of Virginia at this address is this old and this is his birthday. Take the hash of that information and then I just query the blockchain for that hash, and if it says yes, then I'm good to go. It's verified. Can you jump in the back?
We talk trust and security, but can you talk about cyber? What are you actually doing in the area of preventing and offering some resilience to your system, because it will be a target?
Yeah. So I think endpoint security is probably number one, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Making sure that you know that those procedures are followed. And again, that's where we're looking at the trusted aspect of things, is following the DMEA standard, because they're the ones who sponsored the work. So we follow their, I forget the acronym, but we're using their protocol as a starting point, right, for the trusted access to the blockchain itself, just as a starting point. Right. So once that security becomes clear and the right experts are brought in, we're going to grow it from there. But we're starting small. But that's why again, this is all prototype stuff. But you're right. That is a major concern.
So you use one of the database hacking example in the introduction. Can you kind of
Database hacking.
database?
You mean the finger?
Yeah, finger
Yeah.
photo. Can you kind of elaborate how this blockchain-based system can prevent or detect that kind of situation?
Yeah. So one example would be when I receive a board, right? Suppose I'm able to run some kind of a test on it that says, all right, well, when I run everything, this is let's make it up. This is the side channel analysis that looks like this is the side channel that I've traced on here, and there was a test that went on earlier, and that was a side channel that they had. You know, I can query and say, all right, well, is this side channel what I would expect from this component, right? And give some metadata about the component, and then the hash of that information should be the same as on the blockchain. If the dialect changes that side channel at all, then the hash will fail.
So today, I mean, that kind of analysis, everyone who makes the product does that kind of simulation. But today, the reason that we cannot detect the kind of problem is because that expected profile or something, the simulation data is not available to me to cross-check whether.
Right.
Okay.
So that, that's where, again, this is where the research is what is tenable in terms of metrics. You know, I mean, maybe I can weigh the component, and I know that the weight is slightly
Okay.
different than what was done.
Well, you can also have a component or a board or subsystem that has perfectly expectable performance with all functions being present and correct, but functions added that you don't know about.
Yeah. And that's where, you know.
So I should say DARPA has a program under development for this exact thing. It looks at all the attack vectors that are known and will propose a variety of defense strategies.
DARPA's been in that business for 12 years.
I'm just saying specifically in response to Jason Roberts' article, we have an activity in this area.
This article here?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Another naive question, sorry. But
No, it's okay.
when you bring in those data into this, network, how can you trust those data?
Which data?
I mean, say the simulation data
Right.
or spec data for a certain IP. Is there somebody who is kind of monitoring or certify the trustness of those data, or you just bring it into the system?
You know, I don't know.
There has to be a protocol for who's allowed to join, right, which we
And-
talked about a few minutes ago.
That's the trusted supplier piece of it, right? Who's allowed to write to the blockchain right now?
So you're going back to saying your current assumption is you're using whatever the DMEA requirements are to be a trusted supplier. That's your default.
Right.
And that's what you need to pass in order to be a contributor.
Right
To
now,
join
yes.
them. But somehow there needs to be a protocol to be able to join.
Correct. And that hasn't been defined,
Yeah.
right? I mean, other than going through the
blockchain is just a tool. It's an element in the solution. The
Yeah.
system needs to be developed.
Yes.
And that system is usually domain specific and has to be aware of semantics of what you're trying to.
I'm just really glad this is recorded because I don't have my pen to write all this down.
That's good.
Because that's gonna be part of the
That's
research
good.
that we have to do, right? So, that's great, absolutely. Like, I think that there's a lot of value to be had in exploring things just like that.
Really, I mean, I like to think of the simplest thing you could do to do this would be an Excel spreadsheet that you encrypt. That's the simplest version, and then there's a whole spectrum of more secure, more complex ways of doing digital storage of records. But the simplest is everyone puts an entry in the Excel spreadsheet and you encrypt it. That's the most simple way of doing this, and then this is more sophisticated.
Nikhil, is your company more of a services company or more of a technology company? It seems like you're providing a lot of services up front.
Yeah, we're bootstrapping, right? Our goal is to become a product company with a licensed product, right? Where hopefully someday, if everybody pays us some tenth of a penny for every microelectronic component that ships and is COBIA approved, that would be a wonderful outcome. But we're bootstrapping. Like I said, we're using the SBIR program as angel investment in phase 1 and seed stage in phase 2. We are, we're a bunch of data scientists doing data science, and so we are, consulting our way out rather than raising money or anything like that at this point.
Yeah. How would you compare your stuff to something like Guard Time Federal? There's another one called something Spider, I can't remember. Do you know any of these other?
Yeah, I know Guard Time very well. Randy Simpson. And there's a bunch of, there's a lot of great companies. And I'm very fortunate. I used to run a chapter of the Government Blockchain Association, so I got to meet them. And actually, IBM came and spoke. And you know, there's a lot of competition in this blockchain world. You know, I hope when we grow up, maybe we could be as successful as Guardtime. You know, they're a pure blockchain company, right? So they have an enabling technology that can be used in a lot of use cases. We're trying to find a use case and really kind of own that one use case.
The microelectronics use case.
Yeah, in this case, yes. Like I said, you know, we have lines of business. Also, this is ISR Analytics, so we're doing some work on the PA Poseidon program. And the other two we just won right before Thanksgiving. F-35 Pitch Day, we were successfully picked, and we're using Databricks there. So right now we're using a powered by strategy. So powered by Veris Delta, IBM Watson, Databricks, and MicroStrategy. Those are our major technology providers. And in each case, we're looking at a use case and trying to own it, learn it, and create a repeatable business that way as a way to bootstrap until we can come up with our own product.
And one of the challenges of these Air Force SIBRs is that they award, you know, a small amount of money for a study, and then it's on you to go find a government end user in the Air Force.
Yep.
Do you have those guys lined up for all of those projects that you want?
So for Shopman, definitely. Sifter is the F-35 joint.
Who are you
program.
working with at Shopman?
On Shopman, we're talking to MicroStrategy is our main partner. I probably shouldn't mention our customers at this point.
Okay.
But we actually have some memorandums of understanding in the way. We're still looking for more. So if anybody here is willing to talk about predictive maintenance and inventory management, I know it's completely off topic, but please find me.
Good.
Shameless plug.
There, a lot of interest, so I appreciate everyone taking the time out, and I thank, again, Nikhil, thank you very much for I believe the charts will be available, right, Nikhil?
Yeah, I'll send it
And
out.
then we're gonna have a video of the presentation as well, so you know who to get in contact with. Talk with Mike if you have any questions on follow-ups. So thanks, everybody, for coming.
This is part of the